Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. Sophie Reed had always known that the universe held secrets, waiting to be uncovered. As an archaeologist specializing in alien civilizations, she had traveled across countless planets, seeking out the ruins of ancient species long since vanished from the galaxy. But none had prepared her for the discovery she would make on this remote planet, Kuthera. It was supposed to be another routine excavation, just another dig on a forgotten world. However, Sophie had stumbled across something unexpected, an ancient device buried deep in the stone, hidden from all the surveys and scans. The device seemed harmless enough, merely a relic, covered in intricate alien symbols. But when Sophie brushed her fingers over the symbols, a sudden surge of energy crackled through her, and a deep hum filled the air. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the device emitted a blinding light that engulfed her. Sophie collapsed to the ground, disoriented, the world spinning. Before she could gather her thoughts, the sound of heavy boots on the ground echoed through the air. Figures, tall and imposing, stood in the distance. Their armor glinted in the sunlight, strange and unsettling. They were not human. Before Sophie could react, the soldiers descended upon her. She tried to scramble to her feet, her heart racing, but the alien soldiers were too quick. They subdued her easily, their technology far surpassing anything she had ever seen. Their language was unintelligible, but their cold, calculating eyes told her everything she needed to know. She was a prisoner. As they carried her through the dense jungle, Sophie caught a glimpse of something massive rising above the trees, a ship, unlike any she had ever imagined. Its sleek, jagged design shimmered like obsidian, its engines humming with a low, unsettling power. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, she was being taken off planet. Sophie's mind raced. What had she activated? And why was she being taken? There was only one way to find out. Inside the ship, the air was sterile and unnaturally quiet. Sophie was thrown into a cold, metal room. Her arms were bound, and she was left to stew in her confusion and fear. She couldn't help but marvel at the technology around her, glowing panels that seemed to pulse with life, gravity systems that kept her grounded despite the lack of physical force, and intricate alien symbols lining the walls. It was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Then, the door to her cell opened. A tall figure strode into the room, his presence overwhelming. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. He was everything the soldiers had been, alien, terrifying, and yet something about him commanded respect, even fear. His armor was more elaborate than the others, forged of a dark metal that shimmered with an otherworldly gleam. His face was sharp and angular, framed by dark, slick hair. His eyes, deep, almost black, locked onto hers with an intensity that made Sophie's pulse quicken. "I am King Arksak," he said, his voice deep and resonant, though the words seemed to echo in Sophie's mind, bypassing any need for translation. "You activated the artifact. You will answer for your actions." Sophie stood defiantly, despite the knot of fear tightening in her chest. "I didn't mean to." "I know," he interrupted, raising a hand to silence her. "But that does not change the fact that you have now become a part of something much larger than you understand." His gaze softened just a fraction, but it was enough to unsettle Sophie even further. "You are more than just a mere human. You may be the key to something significant." Sophie's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you want from me?" Arksak regarded her for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. There was a strange gleam of interest in them. "Knowledge," he said, his voice cool. "And perhaps something more." Sophie's gut told her this would not be the simple rescue mission she had once imagined. She had no idea what was truly happening, but she was certain of one thing: this alien king, this being, so far beyond anything she had known, was not just interested in her for her expertise. For reasons Sophie couldn't yet understand, she was important to him. "I'll never help you," Sophie spat, though her voice trembled just slightly. Arksak didn't flinch. Instead, he simply smiled, a smile that made Sophie's heart race for reasons she couldn't explain. "You will," he said quietly. "You may not understand why now, but in time, you will." With that, he turned and left her in the dimly lit cell, leaving her to wonder what had just begun. Sophie awoke to the soft hum of the ship's engines vibrating through the floor beneath her. The dim lighting of her cell never seemed to change, it was as though time itself had stopped. She lay on a narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the growing panic in her chest. She had been taken by an alien king. No matter how many times she told herself to stay calm, it was hard to ignore the sheer gravity of her situation. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The door to her cell slid open, revealing one of Arksak's soldiers, a tall figure in black armor, their face obscured. Without a word, they gestured for Sophie to stand. For a moment, Sophie hesitated. She wasn't sure whether to comply or challenge them, but in the end, she knew that resistance would only get her nowhere. She stood slowly, rubbing her wrists where the restraints had left marks. They had been tight, almost painfully so, and despite her best efforts, she had no means of escaping. "Follow me," the soldier ordered, their voice muffled through the helmet. Sophie had no choice but to obey, though a sense of dread gnawed at her insides. The halls of the ship were vast and alien, glowing with strange symbols on the walls. The temperature was controlled, the air slightly too dry, but the ship was nothing if not technologically impressive. She couldn't deny that there was a level of fascination even in this dire circumstance. The soldier led her down a series of corridors, each more intricate than the last. Sophie couldn't help but glance around, trying to absorb every detail, every strange device she saw. If she were in different circumstances, she might have reveled in the chance to study the technology, but now, every corner she turned only brought her closer to whatever unknown fate awaited her. Eventually, they reached a large chamber, its entrance guarded by more soldiers. The walls were adorned with holographic displays, and the floor seemed to ripple with an energy that Sophie couldn't quite understand. The soldier in front of her gave a curt nod to the guards, who opened the massive doors, allowing her to step inside. Arksak was waiting. He sat upon a large, throne-like chair, his regal presence commanding the entire room. The chair was made of dark stone and alien materials, sleek and elegant. Around him stood several figures, counselors, perhaps, or officials from his court. They were all silent, their eyes fixed on Sophie as she entered. Sophie's pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, she felt small under their collective gaze. But she forced herself to stand tall, squaring her shoulders. Despite the intimidating surroundings, Sophie wasn't about to let fear control her. Arksak didn't immediately speak, his eyes scanning her with an intensity that made Sophie's breath catch. Finally, he gestured for her to approach, his voice deep and rich. "Sit with me," he said. Sophie hesitated, her pride pushing her to refuse. But as she met his gaze, there was something in his expression that stopped her, a strange mix of curiosity and something else, something she couldn't name. It unsettled her, but she also found herself strangely drawn to him. Slowly, Sophie walked toward the chair opposite him, and as she sat down, she could feel the weight of the room's attention on her. The air between them felt thick, as if something unspoken hung in the balance. The silence stretched on, and for a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Arksak broke the stillness. "You are wondering why you are here." Sophie nodded, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of speaking first. Arksak leaned forward slightly, his piercing eyes never leaving hers. "You activated the artifact, a device of great importance. It is tied to my people, and to me. I would have never found you if you had not triggered its signal. I do not believe in coincidence." Sophie's thoughts swirled. She had no idea what he was talking about. She had just been examining a piece of alien technology, a simple artifact from a long-dead civilization. She had no way of knowing that it would lead her here, to this alien king. "I don't know what you think I can do for you," Sophie replied cautiously. I'm just an archaeologist. I study ancient ruins. Arksak's lips curled into a slight smile, though it wasn't one of humor. It was calculating, almost cold. You are more than that, Sophie Reed. I know you do not understand yet, but you are connected to this artifact in ways you cannot yet comprehend. She narrowed her eyes. You're not making sense. What does any of this have to do with me? Arksak's gaze softened ever so slightly, but there was no mistaking the weight of his words. You are the key to unlocking the power of the artifact. My people, my empire. We are on the brink of a great discovery, one that could reshape the future of this galaxy. And you will help us unlock it. Sophie's heart raced. A key? To what? She was about to respond, but Arksak raised a hand, signaling her to wait. There is more, Sophie. You were not chosen by chance. The artifact's power is linked to you personally, to your genetic code. You will understand soon enough. Sophie stared at him, her mind reeling. She wanted to deny what he was saying, to refuse whatever it was he wanted from her. But something about his words struck a chord deep inside her. There was a certainty in his voice, an undeniable conviction that made her wonder if he wasn't entirely wrong. I'm not your prisoner, she said defiantly, her voice shaking slightly. I don't care what you think I can help you with. I want to go home. Arksak's expression remained unchanged, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a brief flash of amusement or perhaps something more complex. You will go home when the time is right, he said softly, but not yet. Sophie's chest tightened. She didn't know what was worse, the idea that she might be trapped here indefinitely, or the growing feeling that she was in the presence of something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. But even as the fear swirled inside her, there was an undeniable pull toward him, an unspoken connection she couldn't ignore, though she knew it was a dangerous feeling to entertain. Why me? Sophie asked, her voice softer now. Why did you choose me? Arksak's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, Sophie could see a hint of something human in him, vulnerability, maybe? Or was it just a moment of weakness? You will understand in time, he said, his tone both reassuring and cryptic. For now, we begin the journey together. Sophie didn't know what that journey would entail, but she knew one thing, her life, as she had known it, was no longer hers to control. The days aboard King Arksak's ship blurred into one another. Sophie was granted some freedom, allowed to roam certain areas of the vast starship under heavy guard, but she was never truly free. Arksak, though seemingly patient, had made it clear that she was there for a purpose, though he still refused to explain everything. She found herself both fascinated and frustrated, her mind constantly turning over the possibilities of what this artifact could be, and why she, a simple human archaeologist, had been chosen to unlock its mysteries. In the evenings, she was summoned to his chamber, a vast room with dark walls that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. The holographic screens flickered constantly, displaying alien maps, complex equations, and symbols Sophie couldn't begin to decipher. Arksak would sit at his massive stone throne, his presence commanding the space, and would speak to her of things she could barely comprehend. But through it all, Sophie felt something shifting. Despite her captivity, despite the clear power imbalance between them, she couldn't shake the sense that there was more to Arksak than the cold, distant king she had first met. There was an intelligence in his eyes, a deep understanding of things she had yet to grasp. It made her uncomfortable, but it also drew her in, as though he was the key to understanding everything that was happening to her. One evening, after another of their cryptic exchanges, Sophie could no longer contain her curiosity. She had been studying the artifact's origins in the ship's library, if it could even be called that. The alien texts were nearly incomprehensible, their meaning hidden behind layers of symbols and coded language. But there was one thing Sophie had come to understand: the artifact was ancient. Incredibly so. And it had been lost for millennia, only recently rediscovered through the very signal she had triggered. As she sat in front of the holographic display, her fingers hovered over a map of the galaxy, searching for any clue that might explain how she fit into all of this. That's when the door to the library opened, and Arksok stepped inside. "You've been working late," he remarked, his tone a strange mix of approval and curiosity. Sophie straightened, trying to hide the frustration that had been building inside her. "I'm trying to understand what this is. What you want with me?" Arksok approached her, his eyes scanning the various texts and images she had been studying. His gaze lingered on a symbol that Sophie had been particularly focused on, an intricate design that appeared across many of the ancient artifacts, including the one she had accidentally activated. "You are drawn to the symbol," Arksok observed, his voice low. "It is no coincidence." Sophie looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Arksok's gaze met hers, and for the first time, there was no cold detachment in his eyes. Instead, she saw something far more personal. "It is the symbol of my people," he explained. "The Lost Ones, the race that created the artifact you activated. We were once the rulers of this galaxy. But then, something happened. A catastrophe. A war. And we were scattered, forgotten." Sophie's mind raced. "Your people. You were kings." "We were more than that," Arksok said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "We were gods to the other species, once. Our technology, our knowledge, unmatched." He paused, and for a moment, Sophie could almost feel the weight of his words, as if he carried the burden of an entire civilization's fall on his shoulders. "I'm sorry," Sophie said, before she could stop herself. "That sounds like a tragedy." Arksok's expression softened ever so slightly, though he quickly masked it behind a stoic facade. "Yes. It was." He gestured to the hologram before them, the ancient symbols flashing across the screen. "The artifact you triggered is a key, Sophie. A key that can restore what was lost. But it will not work unless someone of my bloodline unlocks its full potential. And that is where you come in." Sophie shook her head, struggling to make sense of his words. "What do you mean? I'm not related to you. I'm human. I have no bloodline to speak of." Arksok's eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing his next words carefully. "You are connected to the artifact. The connection is unnatural. Your genetic code bears traces of something ancient. It is almost as if you were chosen." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "Chosen? By who? By what?" "I do not know," Arksok said, his voice lowering. "But I do know that the artifact reacts to you in a way it has never reacted to anyone before. When you touched it, the energy surged. It was as though it recognized you." Sophie backed away slightly, her mind reeling. "This can't be possible. I'm just an archaeologist." "Perhaps. But your bloodline is more than you think." Arksok stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I believe your people have a far greater role to play in the future of this galaxy than you realize." Sophie's mind was spinning. She had always believed humanity was just one of many species in the galaxy, nothing special. But now, Arksok was telling her something else. That her very DNA held a secret. That she was part of something much larger than she could ever have imagined. The thought both terrified and intrigued her. "So what now?" Sophie asked, her voice shaky. "What do you want from me?" Arksok's expression softened, just for a moment. "You will help me unlock the full power of the artifact. Together, we will rebuild what was lost. But the road ahead will not be easy. There are forces, other factions, that will stop at nothing to ensure we fail. They know the power of the artifact. They know what it can do." Sophie swallowed hard. "Who are they?" Arksok's eyes darkened. "Others who would see the galaxy remain in chaos. Others who wish to control the power we seek. You will face them, Sophie. And when the time comes, you will have to choose your path. Sophie looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception. But all she saw was truth, and a heavy burden, one that weighed down on him as much as it did her. "I don't know if I can help you," she admitted quietly. "I don't understand any of this." Arksak didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped back, regarding her with a steady gaze. "You will," he said simply. "In time, you will." As the silence stretched between them, Sophie realized that the life she had known, everything she had thought to be true, was slipping away. She was no longer just an archaeologist. She was part of a much larger story, one that was unfolding whether she was ready or not. Sophie had never felt more alone. Despite being surrounded by Arksak soldiers and the endless technology of the alien ship, the weight of her isolation pressed down on her with suffocating force. The galaxy, once vast and uncharted in her mind, now seemed like an endless, hostile expanse, full of dangers she couldn't understand, and that she might never escape. Each day, she spent more time studying the artifact and the alien texts in Arksak's library, trying desperately to piece together the puzzle. But the information she needed remained just out of reach, obscured by layers of language and history she had no way of deciphering. The more she learned about Arksak's people, the more she realized how little she actually understood. His civilization had once ruled the stars, but now, it was a shadow of its former self. And she was somehow tied to it all, her bloodline inexplicably connected to the power of the artifact. Her evenings were still spent in Arksak's company, though their interactions had become more tense. Sophie had long since stopped pretending that she wasn't afraid of him. But there was something else now, a strange, undeniable pull. She couldn't explain it, but her thoughts often lingered on him long after their conversations ended. He had a magnetic presence, an aura that drew her in despite everything she should have been afraid of. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from her, something important. The more she learned, the more she began to see cracks in the calm exterior he projected. It was during one of their usual sessions, when Sophie was attempting to decode an ancient text, that Arksak's mood finally shifted. He had been unusually quiet that day, his mind clearly elsewhere, when a sudden, urgent alert flashed across the ship's command center. Sophie looked up from the holographic display in front of her to see Arksak's face go taut with tension. "What is it?" Sophie asked, her heart racing as she sensed the change in the air. Arksak's expression darkened. "We have company." Before Sophie could ask more, the doors to the chamber slammed open, and an officer rushed in. "Your Majesty, an unknown fleet has entered our sector. They are approaching rapidly." Arksak's jaw clenched. He didn't need to speak for Sophie to understand the gravity of the situation. The tension in the room was palpable, and she could see the flicker of unease in Arksak's eyes. This wasn't just a passing encounter. Whoever was coming, they meant business. "Shut down all non-essential systems," Arksak ordered, his voice sharp. "Prepare for battle." Sophie stood frozen, caught in the middle of something she had no hope of understanding. "Who are they?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. Arksak's gaze met hers briefly, and for a moment, his usual composure faltered. "Enemies. Those who would see us remain lost forever. They know the power of the artifact, and they will stop at nothing to keep it out of our hands." A cold chill ran down Sophie's spine. "What do they want with me?" "They want the artifact," Arksak said, his tone flat. "And they will do whatever it takes to take it from you." As the ship began to rumble with the tension of impending conflict, Sophie's thoughts raced. She was no soldier. She didn't know how to fight. But she was the key to all of this. The artifact, her bloodline, her connection to the lost power of Arksak's people, it all came down to her. And there was no escaping it. "We'll defend the ship," Arksak said, his voice now laced with an edge of command. "But we cannot afford to let them get their hands on you." Before Sophie could respond, Arksak turned sharply, his silhouette disappearing through the door as his soldiers began to mobilize. Sophie was left standing in the middle of the room, her thoughts a tangled mess. There was a war coming, and she was at the center of it. The artifact was her responsibility, her burden, and if she didn't find a way to control it, it would be ripped away from her, and the galaxy would fall into chaos. With trembling hands, Sophie reached for her datapad and began scanning through the ancient texts again. This time, however, her search wasn't focused on deciphering the artifact's origins. Instead, she was looking for something more specific, a clue, a hint, anything that might give her a way to fight back. If Arksak's enemies were coming for her, she needed to understand how to protect herself, how to control the power she had unwittingly unlocked. She was so absorbed in her search that she didn't hear the door open behind her. When she turned, she was startled to find Arksak standing there, his dark eyes intense. He had changed into his battle armor, his figure now a force of imposing authority. "You should come with me," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to prepare you." Sophie swallowed. "Prepare me for what?" "For what's coming," he replied. His gaze softened, just for a moment, but it was enough to make Sophie's heart race. "You will be the key. You must understand how to use the artifact, Sophie. You cannot afford to be unprepared." Sophie stood, her mind still spinning. "How can I use it if I don't even know what it is?" Arksak's expression hardened again. "It is not a weapon, not in the way you think. It is something far more ancient, something that has the potential to reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. But it requires a specific bond, a connection that only you and I share." "Why me?" Sophie asked, her voice almost pleading. "I don't know anything about your people, or your power, or—" "I know," Arksak interrupted, his gaze intense. "I understand that this is overwhelming. But you must trust me. The enemy we face, they will stop at nothing. If they get their hands on the artifact, they will use it to crush us all." Sophie's heart was pounding. The weight of everything she had learned, everything she had yet to understand, was pressing in on her. There was no more time for questions. There was only the immediate need to survive. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Arksak stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I will teach you, but you must listen carefully. The artifact is not just a relic. It is a conduit. It can amplify the will of its user, channeling unimaginable power. But it must be activated with precision. You must connect with it, not just mentally, but emotionally. If you let fear control you, if you let doubt take root, you will fail." Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. She had always prided herself on her logical, analytical mind. But this was different. This was beyond science, beyond reason. It was something deeply personal, and something she had no idea how to control. "Are you ready?" Arksak asked, his voice barely a whisper now. Sophie nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at her. "Then let's begin." The tension aboard Arksak's ship was palpable. Every moment felt charged with the threat of impending battle, and yet Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of being caught in the eye of a storm. The deeper she delved into the alien artifact, the more she realized how little she truly understood, and how much was at stake. Arksak had told her that the artifact was the key to restoring his people's former glory, but the more she learned, the more questions arose. What exactly was she supposed to do with it? And, perhaps more importantly, how could she trust him, this alien king who seemed to hold so many secrets? Arksak's training had been intense, forcing Sophie to push past her comfort zone and tap into parts of herself she never knew existed. She had learned to meditate, to clear her mind, and focus on the artifact's energy. She could feel its presence now, like a distant pulse, faint but unmistakable. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she felt a strange warmth, a surge of power coursing through her fingertips as if the artifact were calling to her, urging her to unlock its true potential. But despite the progress, Sophie's doubts lingered. She wasn't ready for this. She didn't feel like she had any right to wield such power, especially when the very future of the galaxy seemed to depend on it. In the war room, Arksak stood at the command center, overseeing the preparations for the impending battle. His demeanor was cold, calculating, every movement deliberate and purposeful. His advisors and officers were scattered around the room, their voices low as they strategized for the coming conflict. Sophie, who had been lingering at the edge of the room, was once again drawn to the holographic map of the galaxy that dominated the center of the room. The map had become a familiar sight, one that depicted countless stars, planets, and regions she'd never heard of. But one part of the map, a small section near the galactic core, seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity. That was where the enemy was coming from. Arksak noticed her gaze and stepped toward her, his shadow falling over her as he spoke in a low voice. The fleet that approaches is from a faction known as the Zaltar. They are remnants of a once powerful empire, much like my own, but they were never content with peace. They want control. They want to harness the power of the artifact, and they will stop at nothing to get it. Sophie nodded, her stomach tightening with apprehension. And you think they know about me? About the artifact's connection to me? Arksak's gaze flickered to the map, his lips pressing into a tight line. They know. We've had spies in their ranks, and their efforts to locate you have not gone unnoticed. They understand the significance of the artifact's activation, but they believe it can only be used by someone of my bloodline. That's why you are in danger, Sophie. Your connection to the artifact makes you a target. Sophie felt a shiver run down her spine. She had always believed that humanity was insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe, just another species struggling to survive in an uncaring cosmos. But now, she was at the center of a battle that spanned the stars. And for the first time, she wondered if the galaxy had always been waiting for something, or someone, like her. Then what do we do? Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Arksak looked at her, his eyes steely. We fight. But you must be ready. The artifact's power is more than just a tool, it is a weapon. And in the coming battle, you will need to use it. Sophie's heart raced. How? How can I use it if I don't even understand it? I can barely control it. Fear is your greatest enemy, Arksak said, his voice low but firm. You cannot let it control you. You must embrace what you are. What the artifact has chosen you to be. The words hit her like a punch to the chest. Sophie had spent her entire life studying the past, analyzing ancient civilizations and lost histories, but she had never prepared for anything like this. The weight of her responsibility was suffocating. The future of the galaxy, the fate of Arksak's people, and her own survival, all of it rested on her ability to control something she didn't even fully understand. The war room was filled with the sound of rapid commands, the urgency in Arksak's voice rising as the Zaltar fleet drew nearer. Sophie's thoughts were a whirlwind, but one thing became clear, there was no more time to question. No more time to doubt. As the ship entered battle mode, the corridors around Sophie began to hum with energy. The alarms blared, signaling that the fight was about to begin. Soldiers rushed past her, heading to their stations, their faces grim with the knowledge of what was coming. The air in the ship felt thick with anticipation. Arksak turned to face her one last time before they separated to their respective duties. His eyes were fierce, but there was a glimmer of something else there too, something softer, almost human. For the briefest moment, Sophie caught a glimpse of the man behind the king, the one who had once led a mighty empire, and the one who now fought to protect what little remained. Stay close, he said, his voice low. You will need to be near the artifact and the battle begins. It will resonate with the conflict. You must allow it to guide you. Sophie nodded, even though a part of her wanted to run, to escape this weight, to return to the life she had known. But that life was gone, swallowed by the vastness of space and the pull of destiny. She had no choice now. This was her fight. As the door to the war room slid shut behind her, Sophie made her way to the chamber that housed the artifact. The walls were dark, illuminated only by the soft, pulsating glow of the object that had brought her here. It sat in its alcove, waiting. Sophie could feel it now, its presence tugging at the edges of her consciousness, urging her to make a choice. She stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the artifact. The moment her fingers made contact, the room seemed to shift. A wave of energy washed over her, and she gasped, her body tingling with an unfamiliar power. The artifact responded to her touch as if it had been waiting for this moment. Images flooded her mind, visions of ancient battles, of Arksok's people at the height of their power, of civilizations rising and falling in the blink of an eye. She saw the Zaltar, a race of warriors bent on domination, their ships closing in on the starship. Sophie's pulse quickened as the artifact's energy surged through her. This is it, she thought, her mind racing. The power is here. It's mine to command. She took a deep breath, focusing on the energy coursing through her. The artifact had chosen her, and now it was time to accept what that meant. It was time to fight. The battlefield outside the ship's reinforced walls had become a symphony of destruction. The Zaltar fleet, a collection of jagged, menacing warships, had encircled Arksok's vessel, its weapons primed and ready. Sophie stood at the center of the command chamber, the artifact pulsing in her hands, the weight of her responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. The power flowing through her was undeniable, but the fear it invoked was almost as potent. Arksok's presence beside her was a steadying force. His fierce expression, typically unreadable, now bore the weight of a ruler preparing for the final stand. His mind was sharp, focused, but Sophie could sense the deep vulnerability that lay beneath his commanding demeanor. This battle, more than any other, was personal. He wasn't just fighting for his people. He was fighting for his legacy, and for the truth about what had become of his empire. As the hum of energy in the ship intensified, Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, trying to clear her mind. The artifact's connection to her was growing stronger by the second. It called to her, urged her to tap into its power. The visions it sent her way became more vivid, more terrifying. She saw the Zaltar commander, a towering, armored figure whose face was obscured by a dark helmet. His eyes glowed with a sinister red light and his voice echoed in her mind, promising that she would fail. But there was something else in those visions, something that made Sophie's blood run cold. She saw the artifact being ripped from her hands, its energy flashing violently as it was absorbed by an unseen force. She saw Arksok, wounded, his face twisted in anguish, as the very foundation of his empire crumbled to dust. The vision ended abruptly, leaving Sophie breathless. She didn't know if it was a warning or a glimpse into what could come to pass, but one thing was certain: if she didn't control the artifact, if she didn't find the strength to wield its power, everything would be lost. Sophie, Arksok's voice broke through her thoughts, soft but insistent. You're ready. She looked up at him, trying to steady her breathing. I don't feel ready. I don't even know what I'm doing. You don't have to know everything, Arksok said, his voice calm but firm. You just need to trust yourself, and trust the artifact. It's part of you now. You have the power to change the course of this battle. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, her palms slick with sweat. She wanted to believe him. She had to believe him. Her fingers curled around the artifact again, and a surge of warmth coursed through her. The visions flared to life once more, but this time, they were different. This time, Sophie saw herself standing at the center of the battlefield, surrounded by flashing energy beams and the deafening roar of engines. But in her hands, the artifact shone brightly, glowing with a fierce, unstoppable light. It was as if it had recognized her, a part of her, and was now bound to her will. The walls of the command chamber shook as enemy fire struck the outer shields of the ship. The moment of truth had arrived. Now, Sophie, Arksok said, his voice unwavering. Now, you must act. With a deep breath, Sophie stepped forward, moving toward the central control panel where the artifact was kept. She could feel its energy growing stronger, almost as though it were anticipating her next move. Her fingers hovered over the glowing surface of the artifact, and as she made contact, the power surged through her once again. This time, she allowed it to flow freely, embracing it with everything she had. The chamber around her seemed to warp and bend. The air crackled with energy, and for a moment, Sophie felt as though time itself had frozen. She wasn't just holding the artifact anymore, she was becoming it. She could sense the energy of the ship, the weight of the battlefield outside, the presence of the enemy closing in. She could feel Arksak's unwavering belief in her, and it steadied her resolve. Suddenly, the artifact pulsed with an intensity she hadn't expected. A blinding light erupted from it, flooding the entire chamber. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as the power expanded outward, extending far beyond her reach. Through the ship's sensors, she could see the Zaltar fleet in the distance, their weapons poised to strike. But now, she could also see something else, a weakness, a vulnerability in their formation. The artifact had revealed it to her, a tiny opening in their defenses. Sophie. Arksak's voice was urgent. The fleet is vulnerable on the left flank. If you can direct the energy there. Sophie didn't need another command. She raised her hands, and with a focused thought, directed the artifact's energy toward the enemy fleet. The ship's weapon systems responded almost immediately, energy beams shooting out from the ship's cannons with pinpoint precision. Each shot struck a different target, finding the weak points in the Zaltar ships. Explosions erupted in space, the blackness lit up by flashes of brilliant light. The enemy's shields faltered, and their ships began to break apart. But even as the Zaltar fleet reeled from the attack, their commander was not so easily defeated. Through the haze of chaos, Sophie saw him, his imposing figure standing at the helm of a massive warship, his eyes glowing with malevolent power. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a conduit for something darker, something that fed on destruction. He's not just commanding the fleet, Sophie muttered under her breath. He's drawing power from the artifact, he's tapping into the same energy. Arksak's voice was tight with realization. He's trying to steal it from you. Sophie's stomach churned as the commander's ship charged forward, its weapons crackling with dark energy. The artifact's power was fading. She could feel it slipping away from her, the connection weakening as the enemy commander fought to take control. No. Sophie gasped, her fingers gripping the artifact tighter. I won't let you take it. With all the strength she could muster, Sophie focused every ounce of willpower on the artifact. Her mind sharpened, her heart raced, and she called upon the power as though it were her own, demanding its response. The artifact flared to life once again, brighter and more powerful than ever. The energy radiated outward, crashing into the Zaltar ship with devastating force. The commander's vessel shuddered, and Sophie saw his dark figure flinch in pain as the power he sought to control turned on him. The ship was torn apart, its energy dissipating in a brilliant explosion. The battle outside the ship had turned in Arksak's favor. The Zaltar fleet, now leaderless and disarrayed, faltered and retreated. The tide had shifted, and the danger was far from over, but the immediate threat had been neutralized. Sophie collapsed to her knees, exhausted beyond measure, but as she gazed out into the void of space, a feeling of triumph washed over her. She had done it. The artifact was hers to control, and through it, she had protected not just Arksak's people, but the future of the galaxy itself. Arksak was by her side in an instant, his eyes filled with pride. You did it, Sophie. You've saved us all. She looked up at him, her breath ragged. I didn't just save you. I became part of this. I'm part of this galaxy now. And whatever happens next, we'll face it together. Arksak extended his hand to her, a silent promise of alliance between them. The war was far from over, but for the first time, Sophie felt a sense of hope. She had unlocked her true potential, and the future was once again in her hands. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.